Let's break down today what Europe and the US have come to over the past year. Let's start with Europe. In fact, there is no such single entity. And the further away, the more Europe sprawls into private apartments where it's every man for himself. And that's actually a good thing. And NATO doesn't really work anymore, so more and more countries are entering into direct bilateral military cooperation treaties that would be unnecessary if collective security worked. And the current EU mechanisms are trying to change on the fly, because the presence of single opponents of certain decisions blocks the adoption of these decisions. In some places we have to resort to stupid tricks, like luring Orban and the Austrian Prime Minister out of the conference room for coffee during the vote. Well, it is becoming obvious to more and more people and countries that the EU in its current form is just an instrument of colonial management by the US, contrary to the interests of Europeans and individual countries and all ospreys. More and more countries are blocking any form of aid to a country everyone knows we are in conflict with both militarily and financially. Refugee fatigue is building up, they are gradually being removed from their allowances and there is talk of their return, sometimes forcibly, to a well-known country with which we are in conflict. The flagships of the EU, Britain, France and Germany all have huge economic problems. High debts, budget deficit, stagnant economy, sharp rise in the cost of living, striking and rallying population, falling industrial production, etc. Comrade Karmanov posted for clarity. Residents of Britain because of the rising cost of food have to buy it stolen on the black market to diversify their own diet, writes The Guardian. The year 2023 sets a record for shoplifting. The seller's loss amounted to £1 billion, on ours it's over 116 billion rubles. And he also quoted a report the other day, at least 50 fertilizer production facilities have closed in Europe. This is stated in the report of Mitsubishi UFG Financial Group. The largest financial group is one of the 10 largest in the world. Fertilizer production in the EU has become completely unprofitable due to gas prices. 75% of the cost of nitrogen fertilizer is the cost of gas. The rejection of cheap gas from Russia is forcing the EU to shut down its production facilities, which provided all of European agriculture. Fertilizer production in Europe is almost completely halted, which will eventually force Europe to buy fertilizer or grain as early as 2024. In fact, we've been saying this for a long time, that this is exactly what will happen. Factories are fleeing Germany, chemical, metallurgical, engineering, in general, everything high-tech and energy-intensive. Cases of flight to the United States are isolated. Production is mainly transferred to Southeast Asian countries, where logistics are normal and energy resources are cheap. Reduced production means increased unemployment, reduced purchasing power of the population and a shrinking tax base. And from next year, there will also be further reductions in food production. Some people ask why food prices in the EU are rising so much. Because the cost of production has gotten higher and the quantity has decreased. And this is not a plot to throw hungry Europeans against Russia. It probably won't work that way, for drunken Austin requires mobilizing production, not killing it. Europe has become impoverished, weakened and depleted of its armaments over the past year, except for all sorts of Hungarians who disobeyed their overseas friend. The French drained their African colonies. By the way, how is it now? How are the 7 countries in Africa like invading? Because we shouldn't have given our armaments to a country that we have a conflict with. And in general, much less in quantities that they can't make up for. And here is the breaking news that France, Italy and Spain have confirmed withdrawal from Operation Prosperity Guardian against the Houthis blocking the Suez Canal. And refused to turn over their warships to US command. And then there's the Netherlands, Norway and Denmark. NATO is slinging like never before. German media say Scholz's coalition is falling apart and in the coming. The year may see re-elections and, consequently, a new chancellor. Well, let's see. For now, Europe's prospects are not rosy, but in a perverse sense, something I'm confused about their extremism. Now let's move on to the US. The year for them began with a train crash. We even thought at first that it was the partisans who were sabotaging the place. But if you look at the condition of their bridges and railroads, it is obvious that guerrillas are not needed there. And the main saboteur is the US government itself, which has been hammering away at infrastructure for decades. More specifically, right after FDR. In addition to train derailments, factories also burned and exploded on a regular basis. Until about the end of spring. And then we just stopped following it. Also statistically, the number of blackouts, i.e. blackouts in the US this year, has broken all records. The US trade balance has deteriorated with all major counterparties with China, with the EU, even with Mexico. From there, a flood of non-Chinese goods flowed in after the sanctions were imposed. Double-digit inflation, product inflation over 40%, sharp, exponentially increasing debt, both government and household debt. Over $1 trillion a year in debt interest payments alone. More than the Pentagon's budget. The overall performance is worse than in 2008, the year of the mortgage crisis. Consecutive 13 months of falling industrial production. But a recession is not being declared. Because. For the first 6 months, the US was losing Africa. That's where the top US diplomats went. I'm kidding, if anything. Biden's wife, Kamala Harris, and Fishy Blinken. They were put down and sent there in every way possible. The result is a series of anti-French pro-Russian coups. For the second half of the year, the US is losing the Arab world by supporting Israel. I don't want to go over it again. Also, the US is slowly losing control of Europe, and where they are still pushing their line, it is increasingly rejected by the locals and is a losing tactic by a long shot. The army should be the most effective institution of society, for its survival depends on it. The US Army is a super inefficient shapeless heap in which several million man-hours a year are spent promoting inclusiveness, in which 65% of soldiers are obese, in which a quarter of the personnel are understaffed. Therefore, we have to supplement staffing by attracting illegal migrants. Citizenship for service. Also, the US has super expensive and outdated weapons. Patriots even of late modifications are destroyed by Russians quickly and without misfires. Abrams hides somewhere in the rear so they remain invulnerable. The Arabs look at this and laugh wildly. US missile systems often cost more than the targets they are supposed to hit. The Bradleys were dull nonsense even at the time of their inception. And so on. All of this is very expensive and of little use for continental conventional warfare. Military experts can provide more detail on this, so I won't. The election campaign is already in full swing, even though the election is next November. What is unique about the current political situation is that both major candidates are under investigation. This has absolutely never happened before in history. There are 90+ charges against Trump and house arrest. Kind of weird, allowing him to go on tour, but still. Republicans responded by filing 11 charges against Hunter Biden and began impeachment proceedings. Both sides are trying to use RICO, a law designed to fight organized crime, to put their opponent away. The price of defeat has gone up a lot. Whereas in the past the loser just didn't get the power, but was compensated with all sorts of contracts and control over a number of committees in Congress, now the loser goes to jail. And that's a whole other degree of confrontation. Hence the increasing number of administrative interventions in elections. For example, the internal body of the Democratic Party responsible for holding primaries and forming the party structure declares that in such and such a state Biden is recognized as the winning candidate without holding a primary because Kennedy Jr. is winning in that state according to the ratings. Similarly, Trump was prevented from entering the local primary in Colorado by a court ruling. In response, the lieutenant governor of Texas suggested that Biden should be excluded from electoral redistricting in their state. The evening is rapidly ceasing to be a languid one. Nobody cares about democratic procedures. There is an unprincipled, underhanded fiddling of future results. And we won't be surprised when the losing side, any of them, claim election fraud and won't sue this time. Because it's useless, the courts are engaged and biased. He'll call his own to the streets and barricades. Maiden must come home. Thankfully, there are also trailers of the American Civil War being filmed here. The whole trailer is just a bunch of condensed propaganda, and it's immediately clear that it's for Biden and against Trump. The spectacle is promised for next summer. In general, the buildup of socioeconomic contradictions in the US is greater than usual. The tops can't, not at all. The grassroots are unwilling and unable, for they are on the brink of survival. You know what I mean. But since there is no revolutionary party yet, there will not be revolution, but riots. And an obvious abuse of the election. To be continued.